Hello, English learners, and welcome to Listen and Learn English Pod. I'm Sarah, your host for today's listening practice session. This podcast is designed specifically to help you improve your English listening skills through natural conversation and real life stories. Today, I thought I'd share something a bit personal with you all, some of my own struggles and challenges that I've faced in life. Even though English is my native language, life has thrown plenty of obstacles my way, and I thought hearing about real experiences might help you connect with the language in a more meaningful way. Let me take you back to when I was 19 years old. I had just started my first year of college with big dreams of becoming a journalist. I'd always loved writing and telling stories, and I was so excited to finally pursue my passion. But just 3 months into my first semester, my dad lost his job. He'd been working at the same manufacturing company for 20 years, and suddenly, without any warning, the plant closed down and moved operations overseas. My family was devastated. My parents had been saving for my education, but with this sudden change, they couldn't support me financially anymore. I remember sitting in my dorm room when my mom called to tell me the news. I could hear the pain in her voice, trying to stay strong while explaining that they couldn't afford my tuition anymore. I had a choice to make: drop out of college or find a way to pay for it myself. I decided I wasn't going to give up on my education. The next day, I went to the financial aid office and applied for every scholarship and grant I could find. I also got 2 part-time jobs, one at the campus library during the day and another waiting tables at a local restaurant at night. Those next few years were incredibly tough. I would attend classes from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., work at the library from 2:30 to 6, rush to the restaurant for the dinner shift from 7 p.m. to midnight, and then stay up studying until 2 or 3 in the morning. I was constantly exhausted. There were days when I fell asleep during lectures because I was so tired. My grades started slipping, and I began to wonder if I was going to make it. One particularly difficult night, after a long shift at the restaurant where a customer had yelled at me over a mistake with his order, I broke down crying in my car. I was working so hard, sleeping so little, and still barely making ends meet. It felt like no matter what I did, I couldn't catch up. I seriously considered dropping out, but the next morning I received an email that changed everything. I had been awarded a journalism scholarship that would cover half of my remaining tuition. It wasn't everything, but it was enough that I could quit one of my jobs and focus more on my studies. It was like the universe was telling me to keep going, that my hard work was worth it. With a little more time to focus on school, my grades improved, and I even started writing for the college newspaper. My articles caught the attention of one of my professors, who recommended me for an internship at the local news station during my junior year. It was unpaid, which meant I still had to keep my restaurant job, but the experience was invaluable. The internship was challenging in different ways. I was surrounded by talented, experienced journalists who seemed so confident and knowledgeable. I felt like an imposter, constantly afraid that someone would realize I didn't belong there. My supervisor was particularly intimidating, a veteran reporter named Linda who had won multiple awards for her investigative journalism. Linda rarely smiled and had very high expectations. The first story I worked on with her was about local businesses struggling during an economic downturn. When I submitted my first draft, she handed it back to me, covered in red ink. "This reads like a high school essay," she told me bluntly. "Start over." I was crushed. I went to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes before pulling myself together. That night, instead of going home after my restaurant shift, I stayed up researching successful business reporting. I studied articles from major newspapers and analyzed their structure, their tone, their approach to quotes and statistics. Then I rewrote my piece entirely. When I handed in the new version the next day, I was terrified. Linda read it silently, her expression giving nothing away. Finally, she looked up and said, "This is much better. You actually listened to feedback and improved. That's rare." It wasn't exactly glowing praise, but coming from her, it felt like winning an award. Over the next few months, Linda became my mentor, though not in the warm, encouraging way I might have hoped for. Her feedback was always direct, sometimes harsh, but always constructive. She pushed me harder than anyone ever had before. Under her guidance, I learned to dig deeper into stories, to question everything, and to write with clarity and purpose. By the end of my internship, I had produced several pieces that actually aired on the evening news. The feeling of seeing my work broadcast to thousands of people was indescribable. All those late nights, all those tears, all those moments of doubt had led to something real and tangible. I was on my way to becoming the journalist I had dreamed of being. When I graduated college, the job market was extremely competitive. Despite my internship experience, I couldn't find a position in journalism right away. I moved back in with my parents, which felt like a step backward after working so hard for independence. My dad had found a new job, but it paid less than his previous one, and they were still recovering financially. I took a job at a marketing firm, writing content for corporate websites and social media. It wasn't the hard-hitting journalism I had imagined for myself, but it paid the bills and allowed me to help my parents with expenses. I tried to stay positive, telling myself this was just temporary, a stepping stone to where I really wanted to be. Then came another unexpected challenge. My mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. The news hit our family like a tidal wave. Suddenly, my career concerns seemed trivial compared to my mom's health. I reduced my hours at work to drive her to chemotherapy appointments and help around the house. Those months were a blur of hospital waiting rooms, medication schedules, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. I watched my strong, vibrant mother become weak and sick from the treatments. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if she would survive, if our family would ever be the same again. During this time, I started a blog about our experience with cancer. It wasn't meant for anyone but us, just a way for me to process my emotions and keep distant family members updated. But something unexpected happened. Other families going through similar situations found my blog and started reaching out to me. They thanked me for putting into words what they were feeling, for making them feel less alone. Writing had always been my passion, but this was different. This wasn't about crafting the perfect sentence or impressing an editor. It was about human connection in the face of suffering. It reminded me why I wanted to be a journalist in the first place, to tell stories that matter, stories that connect us to one another. My mom's treatment was successful, and after 8 months, she was declared cancer-free. The relief we felt was overwhelming. We celebrated as a family, grateful for her recovery and for the strength we had found in each other during that difficult time. As life began returning to normal, I revisited my career goals. My blog had grown to have thousands of readers, and I had even been contacted by a few publications interested in my writing about healthcare and patient experiences. I realized that while I had detoured from my original path, I had actually been developing my voice as a writer all along. I started freelancing for health and wellness websites while keeping my marketing job. It meant working evenings and weekends, but I was passionate about the topics I was covering. Gradually, I built up a portfolio of published work and made connections in the industry. After a year of freelancing, I was offered a staff writer position at a digital health publication. The job wasn't perfect, the pay was modest, and the hours were long, but I was finally working as a journalist. My experiences had given me a unique perspective on healthcare reporting. I could write about medical issues with both professional knowledge and personal understanding. My articles about patient advocacy and navigating the healthcare system resonated with readers because they came from a place of lived experience. 3 years into my journalism career, I faced another crossroads. The publication I worked for was struggling financially and announced layoffs. I survived the first round of cuts, but the future looked uncertain. Around the same time, I was approached about an opportunity to teach journalism at a community college. Teaching had never been part of my plan. I still saw myself as a young journalist with much to learn, not someone qualified to educate others. But the position offered stability that journalism increasingly couldn't, and part of me was intrigued by the idea of helping shape the next generation of reporters. I decided to take the teaching position while continuing to freelance. My first day in the classroom was terrifying, standing in front of 25 students who expected me to have all the answers made me feel like an imposter all over again. My hands shook as I reviewed the syllabus, and I was sure everyone could tell how nervous I was. But something shifted as I began talking about journalism, the principles of good reporting, the responsibility of telling other people's stories, the impact that thoughtful media can have on society. I saw interest spark in my students' eyes. They asked questions that made me think more deeply about my own practice. By the end of that first class, I realized I had found another passion. Teaching brought new challenges. Some students were unmotivated, just trying to get an easy credit. Others were talented but undisciplined. I had to learn how to engage different types of learners, how to give constructive feedback without crushing confidence, how to balance being supportive with maintaining high standards. I remembered Linda, my tough internship supervisor, and how her demanding approach had pushed me to excel. But I also remembered how I had often felt discouraged and doubtful under her criticism. I wanted to find a middle ground, to challenge my students while also nurturing their growth. One student in particular tested this balance. Michael was clearly talented. His writing had a natural flow, and he had a knack for finding compelling angles to stories. But he rarely turned assignments in on time and would become defensive when receiving feedback. After he missed a major deadline for the third time, I asked him to stay after class for a talk. Instead of focusing on his missed deadlines, I asked him why he wanted to be a journalist. His expression changed as he told me about growing up in a neighborhood that was only mentioned in the news when something bad happened. He wanted to tell different stories about communities like his, stories that showed the complexity and humanity beyond the crime statistics. That conversation changed our dynamic. I started mentoring Michael more closely, helping him develop his ideas while also being firm about professional standards like deadlines. By the end of the semester, he had produced an impressive multimedia project about local entrepreneurs in underserved communities. Seeing his growth was more satisfying than any byline I'd ever had. As I continued teaching, I maintained my connection to professional journalism through freelancing. One of my freelance pieces, an investigation into prescription drug pricing, caught the attention of a producer at a national public radio station. She invited me to turn the article into a radio segment, which led to occasional appearances as a guest commentator on healthcare issues. Radio was yet another new challenge. Writing for the ear is different from writing for the page. and speaking into a microphone with confidence took practice. My first few recordings were stilted and awkward. I would stumble over words and lose my train of thought mid-sentence. The producer was patient but direct in her feedback. You need to sound like you're having a conversation, not reading an essay. I started practicing by recording myself reading news articles aloud, then listening back and noting where I sounded unnatural. I observed how experienced radio journalists modulated their voices, where they placed emphasis, how they used pauses for effect. Gradually, I became more comfortable with the medium. The radio appearances led to an unexpected opportunity. A small podcast network was looking for someone to host a new show about healthcare issues in America. They had heard my radio segments and thought my combined experience as a health journalist and someone who had navigated serious illness in my family would bring authenticity to the role. Starting a podcast meant learning yet another set of skills, interviewing techniques specific to audio, working with sound engineers, planning episode arcs that would keep listeners engaged. The learning curve was steep, but I found the format liberating. Unlike the strict word counts and style guidelines of written journalism, podcasting allowed for more natural conversation and deeper exploration of complex topics. The Healthcare Diaries, launched when I was 29, 10 years after that tearful night in my car when I almost gave up on my education. The first season focused on families navigating serious illnesses and the systemic challenges they faced. I interviewed patients, doctors, insurance specialists, and policy experts, weaving their perspectives together with my own insights. The podcast didn't make me rich or famous, but it developed a dedicated following. Listeners would email me their own stories, sometimes seeking advice, but often just wanting to be heard. Healthcare can be dehumanizing, and many people found comfort in knowing their experiences were shared by others. In the third season of the podcast, I decided to revisit my family's cancer journey. My mom agreed to be interviewed, sharing her perspective as a patient. We talked about her fears during treatment, the ways her illness had changed her outlook on life, and how our family dynamics had evolved through the crisis. Recording that episode with my mom was emotionally challenging, but deeply healing. We discussed aspects of that time that we had never talked about before, how she had worried about being a burden, how I had been afraid to show my fear around her. There were tears, but there was also laughter as we remembered some of the absurd moments that happen even in the darkest times. When the episode aired, the response was overwhelming. It became the most downloaded episode of the series, and we received hundreds of messages from listeners who had been touched by our conversation. Healthcare professionals wrote to say it had given them insight into the patient experience. Families going through similar situations said it had helped them find words for their own complex emotions. That episode marked a turning point in my career. It brought attention from larger media outlets and led to speaking engagements at healthcare conferences. I was invited to consult on a documentary about the American healthcare system. My perspective was valued not just as a journalist, but as someone who could bridge the gap between personal stories and systemic analysis. As my professional profile grew, I faced a new kind of challenge, balancing public success with private doubt. From the outside, my career looked like a series of achievements. Award-winning articles, a popular podcast, speaking engagements, but internally I still struggled with imposter syndrome. Each new opportunity came with the fear that I would be exposed as a fraud, that I didn't really deserve my success. This internal struggle came to a head when I was invited to give a keynote address at a major journalism conference. Standing backstage, waiting to be introduced to an audience of peers I respected and admired, I felt panic rising in my chest. My heart raced, my palms sweated, and I was certain I was going to embarrass myself in front of everyone. In that moment of intense anxiety, I remembered something my mother had said during her cancer treatment. We had been sitting in the hospital during a particularly difficult day, and I asked her how she stayed so strong. She said, "I'm not always strong. I'm often terrified, but I've learned that you can be scared and brave at the same time." You can be scared and brave at the same time. I repeated those words to myself as I walked onto the stage. My hands were still shaking as I adjusted the microphone, but I began to speak anyway. I talked about my journey, including the failures and doubts I usually kept hidden. I shared how my personal experiences had shaped my approach to journalism and teaching. As I spoke more honestly than I had intended, I saw heads nodding in the audience. People were connecting not despite my vulnerability, but because of it. After the keynote, several established journalists approached me to share their own stories of struggle and self-doubt. One Pulitzer Prize winner confessed that she's still worried about her writing not being good enough. A veteran broadcast journalist admitted he still got nervous before going on air. I realized that the imposter syndrome I battled wasn't unique to me. It was a common experience even among the most accomplished professionals. That conference marked a shift in how I viewed myself and my work. I began to understand that authenticity wasn't just valuable in the stories I told about others. It was essential to my own growth as a journalist and educator. The parts of my journey that felt like detours or failures had actually given me the perspective and empathy that made my work meaningful. As I entered my mid-30s, new opportunities and challenges emerged. The podcast network that produced the Healthcare Diaries was acquired by a larger media company, which wanted to expand the show and increase its production value. This meant more resources, but also more pressure to grow the audience and attract advertisers. I found myself navigating unfamiliar territory: contract negotiations, production schedules, marketing strategies. The creative work I loved was now just one aspect of a more complex professional role. There were meetings about audience demographics and discussions about brand alignment that felt far removed from the intimate conversations I had with guests on the show. During this transition, I received a call that brought my professional and personal worlds into sharp focus. My former student, Michael, who had gone on to become a successful journalist at a respected online publication, had been diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. He was 28 years old, about the same age I had been when my mother was diagnosed with cancer. Michael asked if I would help him document his experience with the disease. He wanted to create something that would serve both as personal processing and as a resource for others facing similar diagnoses. Without hesitation, I agreed. We decided to create a special series for my podcast, following his treatment journey in real time. Working on this project with Michael was different from anything I had done before. I wasn't just reporting on someone else's experience or reflecting on my past. I was walking alongside someone I cared about as they faced a life-threatening illness. The boundaries between journalist and friend, between professional and personal, blurred in ways that challenged my usual approach. There were recording sessions in hospital rooms, conversations during chemotherapy infusions, late-night phone calls when Michael couldn't sleep because of pain or anxiety. I struggled with questions of journalistic distance. Was I too close to this story? Was I exploiting a personal connection for content? But Michael was clear about his wishes. He wanted his experience documented honestly, both the medical realities and the emotional impact. The series, which we called In Real Time, unfolded over 6 months. It captured the shock of diagnosis, the grueling nature of treatment, the strain on relationships, the financial burden of serious illness, and the existential questions that arise when facing mortality at a young age. Michael was remarkably open, allowing listeners to witness his fear, anger, hope, and occasional dark humor. When the series aired, it resonated deeply with audiences. Healthcare professionals used it in training programs to help medical students understand the patient experience. Support groups for young adults with cancer shared it as a resource. Media critics praised its honest portrayal of illness without sentimentality or sensationalism. For me, the project reinforced what had become the central theme of my career: the power of authentic storytelling to create connection and meaning. It also reminded me that the most impactful work often happens at the intersection of professional skill and personal experience. Michael's treatment was ultimately successful, though the road to recovery was long and difficult. Watching him return to health and to his journalism career gave me a profound sense of gratitude for his recovery, for the privilege of doing work I believed in, and for the winding path that had led me there. As I approach 40, I look back on the challenges I faced with a new perspective. The financial struggles that forced me to work multiple jobs in college taught me resilience and time management. My mother's illness showed me the importance of healthcare reporting that centers patient experiences. The uncertainty of the journalism industry pushed me to develop multiple skills and find new platforms for storytelling. None of these challenges were welcome when they arrived. Each one seemed like an obstacle to my goals rather than a step toward them. It was only with time and reflection that I could see how they shaped me and my work in necessary ways. I still face struggles, of course. The media landscape continues to change rapidly, creating both opportunities and uncertainties. Balancing teaching, podcasting, and writing sometimes leaves me feeling stretched thin. And like everyone, I have personal challenges that affect my professional life in ways both subtle and significant. But I've learned to approach difficulties differently now. Instead of seeing them as interruptions to my plan, I try to remain curious about what they might teach me, what new paths they might reveal. This doesn't mean I welcome hardship, just that I no longer fear it will derail me completely. If there's one message I hope to share through my story, it's that our struggles don't define us, but they do shape us. The challenges you're facing right now, whether they're related to learning English, pursuing education, building a career, or navigating personal difficulties, are not just obstacles to overcome. They're experiences that will inform your perspective and contribute to whatever you create in this world. I'm reminded of something one of my podcast guests once said. She was a surgeon who had become a patient after a serious accident, and she told me the fracture points in our lives, the places where we break, often become the strongest parts of us when they heal. I've found this to be true in my own journey. So, whatever challenges you're facing as you listen to this podcast, know that they're not just things to get through and forget. They're becoming part of your unique story, giving you insights and perspectives that no one else has. And those perspectives matter. They're what will make your voice, whether in English or any language, worth listening to. Thank you for allowing me to share my story with you today. I will be back with another story soon.